Welcome, everybody. My name is Christian Talbot, and I am the president of the Middle States Association, and I am thrilled to be joined today by Annie Murphy-Paul. I will introduce Annie properly in just a moment, but I want to say thank you to our guests from all around the world, and including some guests who are not even members of the Middle States Association. So we're really thrilled to have you here today. And I want to just say a little bit about why we're doing this work and what success is going to look like. So Middle States is an accreditation organization. We help schools to improve through the work of accreditation. But this year, we've also declared that it's the year of the Middle States Network, and we want to connect members and our friends to resources that are available to us through our Middle States Network. And we started this year with a great conversation with Michael Horn about his book, From Reopen to Reinvent, which is the best thing I read on facilitating change in schools. And then last month, we were lucky to be joined by Jennifer Carolyn, one of the co-founders of Reach Capital, to talk about artificial intelligence in education. And today, we're going to talk about something that is extremely near and dear to my heart as an educator of almost 3 decades, and that is the science of learning. And for that, we have our special guest, Annie Murphy-Paul. So if today is successful, then you will hopefully develop a much keener understanding of the science of learning. It is vital for us to understand this field as educators. And we're going to talk, Annie and I are going to talk about 2 kind of high-level themes. What is an extended mind? As you know, the title of her book is The Extended Mind, her latest book, I should say. And then why does this matter to the world of education? I said that Michael Horn's book was the best thing I've read on facilitating change in schools, and Annie's book, The Extended Mind, is the best thing I've read on the science of learning. And I say that as someone who reads an awful lot. So I'm really grateful to you, Annie, for having written this book, because it really affects the way that I think of the craft. And I still teach, not nearly as much as I used to, but every year I am still teaching. So it's having a direct impact on me, and I'm certain it's having a direct impact on many of the people in the audience. So let me introduce Annie, and then we'll get into a conversation. And after Annie and I have talked through some questions, there will be time at the end for question and answer from the audience. So you probably know, if you signed up for today's webinar, that Annie is an acclaimed science journalist and writer. Her work has appeared in a lot of places. I'm just going to name a few of them: New York Times, Boston Globe, Scientific American, Slate, Time Magazine, The Best American Science Writing, which I think is a pretty awesome plaudit, and lots of other publications. Her book Origins was a New York Times notable book. She's held multiple fellowships in science journalism, in education journalism, and in learning sciences. Her TED Talk has been seen by more than 2.6 million people. She has been a lecturer at Yale, her alma mater, a senior advisor at the Yale University Poorvu Center for Teaching and Learning. And just on a personal note, and really the reason for the invitation I extended to Annie, is that I started following Annie's scholarship about a decade ago when I was the head of school at Malvern Prep. And she and I corresponded back then, and a number of years intervened between our last correspondence and this past couple of months. But it's been great to be reconnected with you, Annie. Great to see you finally face to face. And thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights about the science of learning.
Thank you, Christian. I'm so happy to be here and so happy to connect with you, as you say, after all these years.
Right. Okay, well, let's start with something pretty straightforward, but I think essential for laying the context, setting the context for the audience. What exactly do you mean when you talk about an extended mind?
Yeah, good question. So I should say, first of all, that the extended mind is an idea that is not my own. I borrowed it from 2 philosophers, Andy Clark and David Chalmers, who first proposed it in an article in a philosophy journal back in 1998. I, as you noted, Christian, had been delving very deeply into the science of learning, reporting, researching, writing about that subject. And I don't want to get to, I know you have a question for me about how this book started, so I don't want to jump ahead to that. But basically, in the course of that research on the science of learning, I came across this idea in a philosophy journal about the extended mind, which was unfamiliar to me at the time. And it's still kind of a niche idea. And to the extent that my book makes it a more well-known idea, I would be pleased if that were the case, because I think it's a really powerful and generative idea. I've been working with it and thinking about it for many years now, and I still find it endlessly interesting. And I think the best way to explain what the extended mind is might be to start by saying what it's not. And what it's not is a quite familiar idea. We may not name it or recognize it as such, but it's like the water we swim in. And the counterpoint to the extended mind would be what we would call the brain-bound notion of what a mind is. That the idea that the mind is contained within the skull, that thinking happens up here and only here. And that's really the model. The brain-bound model is the one that our education system and our larger culture have been built upon. And it's so much so that it can seem obvious and not even sort of worth investigating. But Andy Clark and David Chalmers came along and said, in fact, this was the first line of their seminal article. They asked, where does the mind end and the rest of the world begin? And again, from a brain-bound perspective, the answer is simple and obvious. Well, the mind is enclosed in the skull. It ends at the skull, and end of story. But Clark and Chalmers made the case in that original article, and then Andy Clark in particular sort of ran with it in several more wonderful books. That actually that's not true. That the mind extends beyond the skull, beyond the brain, into our bodies, the sensations and movements of our bodies, into physical space, the spaces in which we think and learn and work, into our relationships with other people, and into our tools, which I know we'll be talking about today, our tools with which we do our thinking. So to me, this was, it really grabbed me from the very first time I read this article about the extended mind, because it was such a challenge to the way I had always thought about thinking. And, I'm a thinker and a writer for a living, and I do live a lot in my head. So it felt like a somewhat personal challenge to me, that how could it be that that thinking wasn't only going on inside my head, but was actually taking place out in the world? That was a provocative idea to me, and it's as I say, it's one that that still holds my interest, and I see applications of it, everywhere these days.
Yeah, I know we're going to come back to this, but I just want to put a fine point on something that you said at the start of your remarks, which is that our entire education system is predicated on the assumption that the mind is in the brain, and the brain is only inside the individual and inside their skull in particular. And once we rethink that assumption, I think it has just enormous consequences for what I think of as like the design of school, a design on multiple levels. I'm not talking only about architecture, although we'll come around to that. So I think it's a provocative idea, as you said. I think it's a powerful idea. You also use the word generative, and I love that notion, because I think with the right understanding, or a better understanding, which the book provides and that you're helping us with today, we can really rethink and generate new possibilities for what great learning looks like. So we'll come around to that in just a little bit. But I know that originally you thought you were going to write a different book, and then you ended up, I remember getting an email from you years ago, and you said, I thought I was going to write this book, but I'm discovering I need to write a different book, and then didn't hear from you for a while, and then mine came out. So
yes, I had set out to write what I thought would be a very straightforward book about the science of learning, because there was so much, and is still so much, exciting, important research on how we learn that is emerging from the labs of scientists all over the world. And I wanted to, my idea was that there needed to be some kind of bridge between that research that could potentially be so useful to students and teachers and parents, and but they weren't necessarily getting the benefits of that research, the fruits of that research, in a way that was accessible. So I did do that for a while. I had a newsletter, and I wrote endless, articles about the science of learning, and had a very enjoyable time as a writer exploring that realm. And I have 2 school-age kids, so it was also, personally very interesting and engaging to me. But when it came time to write a book on the science of learning, the problem that I ran up against was that I think of myself as an ideas journalist, essentially. I mean, I've written about a number of different subjects in my career, but the thing that I think unifies all of my work is that I love a big transformative idea that changes the way that you see the world. I mean, that would be aspirationally what I'm after. It's what I look for in my own reading, and it's what gets me excited as a writer. And what I found with the science of learning, I looked and it may be out there, but I didn't find it. I was looking for some kind of grand unified theory of learning, a big idea that could pull all these strands together that I'd been collecting for many years. And I couldn't find it in a way that was satisfying to me. And in the end, I concluded that the reason is that there's no grand unified plan for organizing the brain. The brain is the learning brain. The brain is a kludgy kind of patched together, product of evolution, and it's oriented, of course, towards our survival. And there's a lot of interesting work on the ways in which we've adapted the brain's organic structures to the task that it didn't evolve for, but that we very much need in our modern world. So I find that that line of work very interesting. But again, there wasn't, because of the nature of the brain, there just wasn't one big idea that could capture or contain all of the science of learning research that I wanted to write about. So that's when let me give a little plug here, because I think someone has written that book now. It's just out now. It's by one of my favorite researchers in the field, Daniel Willingham. He's written a book called Outsmart Your Brain. And it's the book that I would have written or would have liked to have written. And Dan, of course, did it in his own inimitable way. And so I recommend that for anyone who wants that kind of overview of the learning sciences in a very practical, accessible way that is at the same time it does kind of turn on its head a lot of our assumptions about how we think learning should work and how it actually does work. So I really recommend that book. But for me, the path just ended up winding through the extended mind. Once I came across that article, as I mentioned, that it quickly became clear to me that was going to be the core that I could sort of attach all these other interesting areas of research, the spine that would bring all those things together.
Yeah. And Dan Willingham not only has a new book, but he has also got a TikTok channel, apparently. So
yeah, he's a TikTok star. Yes, yeah. I love it.
So let's talk a little bit about why this big idea, and it is a really big idea, of the extended mind matters. And let's marry it with another big idea and reality now, which is artificial intelligence in learning, and in particular ChatGPT. So I want to just set a little bit of context and then pose a question to you about ChatGPT. So your book, as you said earlier, is divided into really kind of 3 big sections: that we can think with our bodies, we can think with the built environment, and we can think with our relationships. And at the start of your introductory comments, you said, and now maybe we should also be thinking about how we can extend our thinking with tools. Yeah. So when you think about ChatGPT, how might that either expand your rubric for what it means to have an extended mind, or deepen the rubric for what it means?
Yeah. And do we assume everybody out there knows what ChatGPT is, Christian?
That's a great question. Let's not assume that. So we talked about this with Jennifer Carolyn, but for the benefit of those who might not have been on that webinar, ChatGPT is a chatbot that works off a large language model, which is a very specific kind of artificial intelligence. There are multiple kinds of artificial intelligences. And so a large language model is trained on a huge volume of text. And then it makes basically predictive responses about answers based on this massive volume of text. So ChatGPT is just one brand, if you will, one product built on a large language model. There are lots of others of them out there.
Yes, and it's been of particular interest to educators, as I understand it, because of the potential. It seems to be a leap ahead of any other tools that we've encountered, right? And it seems to be able, with some hiccups, to potentially write, homework assignments, papers, in a way that is hard to detect, and obviously is not evident. It would not provide evidence of the student's own learning or own ability. So that's the concern, and that's the but also the great interest and in some quarters excitement about a tool like ChatGPT. And I've been reading the news coverage avidly as well, and thinking about what it means. And I'm kind of two minds about ChatGPT, and I would argue that we kind of need to be of two minds about tools like this. My first mind, as you might say, is that we often have a reaction of fear or trepidation around tools that seem to that could potentially replace the human mind or compete with it, and I actually take a lot of reassurance in the views of the originators of the extended mind theory, that this isn't something to fear. In fact, it's something that we're already doing all the time, and Andy Clark, one of those philosophers, and he has a particular way with words. He likes to say that humans are intrinsically loopy creatures, meaning we are intrinsically, innately apt to extend and enhance our own thinking by looping it out of our brains through other entities, whether that's our own bodies, through the minds of other people, through the physical spaces in which we're working, and now, through the mind, if it can be said to have one, of ChatGPT. And I actually, I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post a couple of years ago that argued that perhaps all tests, making the case for the idea that all tests should be open book, because out in the world, of course, where we want our students eventually to go and to thrive and to succeed, out in the world, everything is open book. We use every tool and resource at our disposal to solve problems and to get our work done. And in fact, it's the skillful use of those tools that is going to distinguish someone who's able to do good work. So isn't that a skill and a capacity that we want to begin training our students in as early as possible? Then there's my other mind when it comes to ChatGPT. And here I am guided very much by Daniel Willingham and his work, which is rooted in cognitive science and shows us very clearly that it's not enough for us to be able to Google whatever fact we need at the moment we need it. It's not enough for us to know where to get information. In order to be a truly educated, truly intelligent, truly effective and capable thinker and person, we need to have a whole lot of knowledge committed to our, stored on the original hard drive, as you might say, which is our brain. And to me, the analogy that makes sense is that, say that you had a technology that allowed you to look up words in a foreign language, one at a time, and translate it fluently for you. And you brought that along with you to a foreign country that you were visiting. Would it be the case that you were fluent in that language because you have this technology that could translate for you word for word, what you were wanting to say in that foreign language? No, actually, to be fluent in a language and to do everything you'd want to do with that language, communicate with other people, understand what's going on around you, get a sense of that culture from the inside, you'd actually have to have a lot of vocabulary, a lot of grammar, a lot of idioms stored in your own brain. So I think what we want is to have those two things work together, to have all that rich, elaborated knowledge stored in our own brains, but also become very skilled at using these tools that, after all, human beings and their own intelligence have created for our use. So I think there's so much to work out in terms of how teachers interact with this new technology. There's so much still to work out, but I think it's potentially a very exciting development.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think your explanation of being of two minds about it is an elegant explanation of the way in which a tool, and it is a tool like ChatGPT, can be used to extend our thinking, but that, as Willingham and others point out, actually the person who, for me, best clarified the idea that you need a certain base of knowledge on the hard drive is an Israeli scholar, Efrat First. And I think of it, the way she's visualized it, is that there are essentially individual units of facts or knowledge that one can possess, and that you need a certain baseline amount of that stuff to be able to build more and more sophisticated knowledge. And to me, it's sort of like Legos. Like you need a certain number, just like literally a sheer volume or quantity of Lego pieces. And once you have enough of them, you can combine them and recombine them into all sorts of almost endlessly interesting things. But if you don't have enough Lego pieces, you're going to have massive gaps where you just can't do stuff. And so I do think that there's a lot for educators to think about in terms of both knowledge acquisition and then the creative use and manipulation of that knowledge through the extension of something like a ChatGPT.
Agreed.
So there's another big idea. Well, let me pause and just say, this is sort of a confession to the audience. I know that when I was a younger teacher, I was convinced that students' access to the internet and Google and sort of like this blank slate notion that you could just stick a computer in a room with a kid and they would learn. I was enamored with that idea and really believed that there was just this huge green field in front of us. And in some ways that was true. But what I came to learn through writers like you and Willingham and others is that there is a tremendous amount of information and knowledge and high context knowledge that students need before they can make truly productive use of those tools. Doesn't mean we shouldn't have them experiment with those things, but we have to be really thoughtful about the science of learning when we ask students to use those tools. And I bring that up because probably one of the most important ideas I came across sometime after that was the idea of cognitive load. It's not something that I learned in college. It was not something that I learned as an early teacher in professional development sessions. And at some point on Twitter, I think it was Oliver Cavaglioli, who's a British designer and former head of school, who said that if there were only one thing that he could pick out that was transformational for his understanding of how learning was happening in his classroom, it was understanding cognitive load. That once he figured that out, the way he designed lessons, the way that he interacted with students, the way that he assessed them completely changed. And one of the things that you talk about in the book is cognitive load, and you talk about it in multiple places, which I really appreciate because it affects the mind in the body, in the space, and in relationships. And then there's this related idea of working memory. And so for the lay people out there, cognitive load and working memory, why are those two concepts so important for educators?
Yeah. And so important to the idea of the extended mind, because essential to the idea of the extended mind is that the biological brain on its own is quite limited, and that's actually comes as a surprise to many people, because we've absorbed this idea from our culture. And once you start seeing this, you see it everywhere, that the brain is this amazing, astonishing organ, the most complicated entity in the universe. This is the way the brain is sort of sold to us in popular science accounts. And there's a lot of truth to it. The brain is really amazing, but it's also quite limited in the ways, and for the reasons that we were talking about earlier. It's a product of evolution. It evolved to do very different things from what we expect it to do now in our modern sort of knowledge-centric world. It has limitations on its memory, its attention, its ability to understand. And I think, and this is a particular point that I always try to make because it's been very important to me, that we tend to blame ourselves. And because of this sort of fetishization of the brain and this worship almost of the brain, when our own brains fail us, we feel like it must be our fault, or there's something wrong with our particular brain, you know? And so what's so important to me about the underlying sort of foundation that leads to the theory of the extended mind is that all of our brains are limited in this way. And that's why we need the extended mind, because there's a gap, and it's a big gap, and it's a growing gap between what the naked brain, as again, Andy Clark likes to call it, the biological brain on its own can do, and what we expect it to do in our very complex modern world. And that's where cognitive load comes in, that actually the tsunami of information that we have coming at us all the time, even the amount of information we expect students to be able to absorb and process and work with, is often more than our brains can really handle. And one of the reasons for that, I'll just talk briefly about the differences between expert minds and beginner minds. You know, our students are often novices, and teachers are usually experts. And one thing that is a characteristic of expertise is that people who are experts have over time created structures in the brain that allow them to handle much larger quantities of information much more quickly and more adeptly than a student or a beginner who's still struggling to learn the basics, you know. And it's very easy for the expert to not even be in touch anymore with how difficult it is for someone who is just beginning to master a subject. And so that's one reason why cognitive load is in the classroom is often exceeded. The student's cognitive load is often exceeded. So where the extended mind can, and that's where a lot of problems with memory and attention and understanding come in. And where the extended mind can come in and help with that is that we can use resources outside of the brain to relieve some of our cognitive load. One of my favorite examples of that is gesture, that it turns out that, you know, I'm gesturing right now as we struggle to incorporate new information, to explain something, to understand something that we don't already have a settled understanding of. That's very hard work for the brain, and our cognitive load is easily exceeded. And so what we tend to do is offload some of that work, that mental work, onto our hands. And people who are asked to explain something that they are just beginning to grasp tend to gesture much more, for example, than people who are explaining something that they already understand very well. So gestures are one way that an outside the brain resource can absorb some of that cognitive load. We can use space, physical space, to absorb some of that cognitive load by cognitive offloading is the term, to get ideas and information out of our heads and onto physical space, whether that's, you know, a bunch of Post-it notes or a big whiteboard. We can relieve our an excess of cognitive load by using the minds of other people. You know, when we engage in brainstorming or in thinking as a group, often that's a task that would be overwhelming for one brain is effectively distributed among a number of brains. And so we can do things that we couldn't do with our individual brain-bound minds. So I think cognitive load is such an essential idea as related to the extended mind, because it's kind of why we need the extended mind, because the biological brain on its own is not up to the job.
Yeah. One of the things I love in the book is your example about actors and how actors use really almost kind of like three things. They're using, of course, their brains and their memories of their script, but then they're using gesture, words with gestures, and then they're using the three-dimensional space around them with blocking to move to spaces. And it's that sort of triangulation, almost having like three different minds in a way that allows them to remember and perform volumes of stuff that we would think, I could never memorize that, but actors do it routinely.
Right. And they do it by drawing on resources outside of the brain. They might not be able to do it otherwise. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's a direct application for teachers in the classroom to encourage students to use gesture to move around the physical space of the classroom to the extent that that's possible and desirable, in order to get them to internalize some of those building blocks of information and knowledge, so that they can chunk them later on, as the moving towards the expertise level that you described. Another huge idea in the book, and something that I've long been fascinated with, is the supply-demand curve on attention. And I remember I had a real light bulb moment again when I was at Malvern. I was a new head of school. I had never done anything even remotely like that job before, and within any given day, I often had to switch contexts, 10 to 15 times. And so even as many notes as I might take in my notebook to try to remember just the sheer facts of a conversation, it was overwhelming. Yeah. And at some point, I realized that, contrary to popular perception, our most valuable resource is not time. I think it's attention. And time is an incredibly valuable resource, but I think the limits on our attention are the hardest limits that we have for thinking. And I love that your book talks about attention and the supply side of attention. So can you talk a little bit about what you mean when you talk about the demand side and the supply side of attention?
Sure. Yeah. So I think a lot of us spend a lot of time thinking about our attention because, as you say, Christian, it's such a limited resource, an important resource, but we tend to think of it in a particular way as a resource that we spend. How am I going to allot my attention? How am I going to direct it? How am I going to get upset when it gets grabbed by something that I don't want it to be grabbed by? But we don't think as much about, we think about emptying the tank and how to do it, but we don't think about refilling the tank. I mean, that's the metaphor that makes sense to me. And yet, our attention is a renewable resource in the sense that there are steps we can take to restore our attention when it's been drained by the very demanding activities that we often expect of ourselves. And that particular discussion that you're noting in the book comes from a chapter on the natural environment, because there's, even within the framework that we've talked about my book, it's further broken down, and I talk about how we think with the built environment, how we think with the space of ideas, which is what I was referring to before when I talked about cognitive offloading, but then also about natural spaces, being outside, and it turns out there's a fascinating body of research known as attention restoration research that looks at why and how being outside and the particular qualities of what it's like to spend time in the outdoors, why and how that seems to have a restorative effect on our attention. And the short version of it is that, again, we're creatures of evolution. We evolved in the outdoors. This world where we spend almost all our time inside is an evolutionary anomaly. And so our perceptual faculties evolved in such a way that we very easily and effortlessly process the kind of information and stimuli that we encounter in the outdoors. And if you think of, we kind of know this because we often have that feeling of feeling quite relaxed and at ease when we're outside. And part of it is that we pay attention in a very different way when we're outside. When we're inside, we're often very focused in a very hard-edged kind of way, on our screens or on a piece of paper. But when we're outside, our attention is more what psychologists call diffuse. It's drawn here and there, but in a very effortless kind of way. We might watch the clouds in the sky or, leaves rustling in the breeze. And it's very pleasant. It has a very positive affective state that it brings on in us. But it also restores our attention in the sense that if we spend even just a few minutes outside, and it doesn't have to be beautiful nature either. I mean, people have asked me this, is it okay if it's, the back corner of my campus or whatever? It's not necessarily like a gorgeous arboretum or something, but no, it's just the green, as I say, the kind of stimuli and information that is just sort of naturally encoded in outdoor settings. And even looking out the window can have some of that same effect. So there's all of that as it applies to us, teachers and administrators and adults. But I think it's also really important to think about in terms of children and students, and giving them access to nature as much as possible. There's also beautiful research about how children's play in nature tends to be more imaginative than their play indoors. There's so many reasons to get kids outside, but I think that attention restoration effect is a really important one to think about.
Yeah. I would not have thought of this question if you didn't just say what you said, but I'm wondering about pulling together a few threads. So, when it comes to gesturing, I think it's not an uncommon bias for people to say, well, you're counting with your fingers. That's very childish to do. Mm-hmm. When in fact, as you said, like the science of it is, no, you're offloading a certain amount of cognitive load so that you can perform the mathematical operation as well as possible. And when it comes to physical environments, I think sometimes the idea that we should make the room greener. I have a plant behind me, for example, bringing the outside indoors or getting outside, that's somehow touchy-feely or like that has nothing to do with real learning, but in fact, it might very much have something to do with the supply side of attention and how we learn. And even as we were talking earlier about actors moving around the physical space of a stage, for example, there is I think a justified critique of the idea of learning styles. But at the same time, the kinesthetic movement clearly has a benefit for extending our thinking. And I'm wondering, Annie, if you come across certain kinds of biases in educators more frequently than others. I don't know if any of those biases I just suggested are prevalent in your mind, but I guess I'm asking the question because I'm wondering, do we as educators have blind spots that you help us to see a little bit more clearly or see in the first place?
Yeah. Well, the biggest bias, and it's not only found among educators, but among everyone in our culture, is just this belief in a brain-bound way of thinking. That is itself really nothing more than a prejudice and a bias that we've inherited from a culture that thinks that mind and body can be separated and that mind is somehow superior, and exists in some kind of ethereal realm, above this grubby material world of the body and of things and of spaces. So I think that's a bias that's woven throughout our culture and of course shows up in our schools as well. I really also do see at play a bias that you alluded to a moment ago, Christian, which is that we seem to think that all of these outside the brain activities are okay, they're fine, for little kids. Like you can use manipulatives when you're learning math. Sure, you can grow seedlings and be interested in nature when you're a little kid. And sure, play is great and social interaction for little kids is fine. But we're expected to sort of put those things aside as we get serious, and certainly by high school and college, the idea is that thinking means locking yourself alone in a room, and not coming out until you've solved the problem or finished your work. And I think that's foolish, because adult brains and teenage brains are just as in need of extraneural resources. That's another way to put to phrase outside the brain resources. And in fact, studies of experts, people who are masters of their craft, show that they are extremely adept at using these outside the brain resources. They know when to use them, they know how to use them, they use them very smoothly and fluidly. And so actually, if we want to be guiding ourselves and our students to that kind of mastery level of performance, then we actually want to be using the extended mind, our extended minds, as, you know, learning to use them as skillfully as possible, and not thinking of it as something juvenile or childish and to be left behind.
Yeah, I fully agree. Annie, there were so many things in your book that I loved, so it would be impossible for me to pick one thing. But if I were to pick the one thing that was most striking for me and most affirming for me as someone who has tried to evolve my practice, my craft as a teacher, it would be your section on thinking with peers, through your relationships, and even more specifically social learning. So I want to set the table here again with some context and actually provide some brief quotes from the book, because I think that there's a lot for teachers to learn about this section of the book in particular. And it also strikes me as one of the biases that some educators still have against allowing students to act as teachers or as tutors for peers to learn from each other. And to go back to something you said at the beginning of our conversation, school largely has been designed with the notion in mind that the brain is in the skull. And a variation on that is that we've kind of designed learning as a single player sport, but it might be better understood as a team sport. So there are three quotes in particular that I want to share with the audience, and then I'd like to ask you a question about social learning. So the first is that the development of intelligent thinking is fundamentally a social process. The second is that our brains evolved to think with people, to teach them, to argue with them, to exchange stories with them. And then finally, the brain, this was really startling to learn this, not surprising, but kind of startling. The brain stores social information differently than it stores information that is non-social. Social memories are encoded in a distinct region of the brain, and we remember social information more accurately. So clearly, when it comes to the science of learning, this to me, as a lifelong educator, feels like an underemphasized area. I never learned any of this stuff at any point in my professional development. So what would you want school leaders and teachers to know about the power of social learning to extend the mind?
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking about that, Christian, because I find this aspect of the extended mind really powerful as well. And again, it's pushing back against a very entrenched and embedded bias in our culture. You know, I talked earlier about how we have this notion that mind and body are separate and that somehow mind is superior. We also have a related notion that intellectual activities, academic activities are over here, and social activities are on the other side of this realm. And you can see that in the way that we arrange the school day for students, right? It's like there are certain times when students are allowed to engage their social brains. You know, you can talk at recess, or you can talk in the cafeteria at lunchtime. But when you come into class, now think this is serious. You know, put away that social side of yourself. Don't talk to your neighbor. Don't work with other students. This is a single player sport, as you said, Christian. And that is really just a fundamental misunderstanding, I would say, of how the brain works. Because as you quoted from my book, the brain is fundamentally social, and it's social all the time. It's not social, you know, in sort of convenient 30-minute increments. And so what teachers might want to think about is not so much suppressing or putting aside the social brain in order to engage the academic or the intellectual brain, but rather leveraging and harnessing the social brain in the service of thinking and learning. And so 3 of the activities that are most effective for doing that, and you mentioned this also in the quote from the book, is teaching other people. And I think all of us who have been teachers know how much better we learn a subject when we have to teach it to someone else. But there's that has to do again with the social motive. We want our students to, our pupils to learn. We in the process of engaging in that social back and forth, we discover what we ourselves don't know yet or don't understand completely, and we just care a lot more. But there's a motivation that comes from that kind of socially engaged learning that isn't there when you're studying it on your own just to get a good grade on a test. So teaching other students, peer teaching is one of those really central activities for leveraging the social brain in the classroom. Another is telling stories. And this is a subject that Daniel Willingham, again, is really great on, because he talks about how stories occupy a psychologically privileged place in the brain. We listen to stories more attentively, we understand them more clearly, we remember them more accurately than information that's presented in a non-story kind of expository form. And it's quite easy actually to build stories into teaching, but it's not something we necessarily do. We think it's more efficient maybe to just sort of like lay out the information, not engage that social narrative aspect of our brains, but that's again kind of a missed opportunity. And then thirdly, debating and arguing with each other is a really natural way to learn, and again to care, to have that motivating force behind our learning, which is so often a problem with students. It's kind of like, no matter what often what gets asked by students is, why do we have to learn this? And they're referring to the content. It doesn't seem relevant, but I think also they might be referring to the way we're learning this doesn't make sense to me, doesn't engage me, doesn't grab me. Whereas these activities of teaching others, telling stories or listening to stories and arguing and debating are things that are kind of universally appreciated and enjoyed by students and by all people. So these are powerful tools that we should be using as much as possible, I think.
Yeah. In a moment, I want to turn to Q&A from the audience, but two things. One is, I don't want to take credit for the notion that we've set up school as a single player sport, when it's a team sport. I heard that for the first time many years ago from Jamie Cassup, who used to be Google's chief education evangelist. So Jamie deserves the credit for that. It's always stuck with me, I think, for good reason. And the second thing is, just to come back to your last point, the emotional salience of social learning, to me, is an under-leveraged resource that we have as educators, that once we realize that the brain is wired for social learning, and that we hunger for making the other person understand, or getting them as excited as we are, or for feeling some emotional exchange, that's not something that we should be prejudiced about and put off to the side. And as you said earlier, think of like, learning as a purely rational exercise, and all the social and emotional stuff can go over there. Seems like they're kind of almost twin strands of DNA that together they create something that's emergent and far more powerful, because it is so emotionally salient to learn. And social things. Actually, before we go to the Q&A from the audience, just one follow-up question on the idea of social learning. And I just heard yesterday, I was listening to a podcast, Masters of Scale, with Reid Hoffman, and it's about ChatGPT. And Reid Hoffman's point of view is, he's been studying and sort of on top of artificial intelligence for a long time. That's been his career as a tech founder and investor. And his point of view is, at some point, probably sooner rather than later, every one of us is going to have what he calls a co-pilot. That AI will be a co-pilot for the teacher to help you create your lessons and your assessments, and maybe even other things. For a writer, it might be using ChatGPT to generate the first outline of your next blog post. And when I hear the term co-pilot, I think of literally another person. And there was something interesting in your book about the video deficit, that if we only watch videos because they're not static, I mean, the images are moving, but there's no exchange going on, like you're watching passively. The direction of the flow is one directional, right? Do you think that ChatGPT kind of changes the model a little bit because it can at least simulate, it may not be real, but it can simulate a social interaction? Do you think that we might have co-pilots who are artificial, but because they are good enough at simulating a social exchange, might actually extend our minds in other ways that we aren't expecting yet?
Interesting. I haven't really thought about that, Christian, but my first impulse in responding is to note that humans have this really irresistible tendency to personify, all kinds of things that we encounter. Like we see faces, in cars or houses, or, and we respond to that because, again, we're so fundamentally social. We're always looking for the person, even in things that are inanimate, and so if our technology becomes so sophisticated that it can actually simulate an interaction between ourselves and this tool, and that's at the base of this finding about the video deficit, especially among young children, that they learn nothing or almost nothing from a one-directional instructional video. But if it's their grandparent on the, who's on Zoom and interacting with them, it's that contingent interaction that actually does allow for learning. And I think, although the video deficit finding is specific to young children, I think that kind of contingent interactive learning is what works for all of us at any age. And I think as our tools get better and better at doing that, we may come to regard them as social partners in the sense that we would regard another person as a social partner. That there's just some scary or uncanny elements of that, but I think that's what we're looking at down the line here.
Yeah. For those in the audience who have not yet read Annie's book, the notion of contingent interaction and contingent communication to me was like such a light bulb going off, because as teachers, we know this intuitively. I had no model in my head for what you were talking about until I read that description of, like, I'm waiting for the person to say something because I don't even know yet what I think until I hear them say something. And the contingency of the interaction is where it's almost like it's like the space in between where the learning is happening, but it's required. It's like the fertile soil. It's not the plant itself that comes out, but that soil has to be sufficiently fertile or contingent in order for the learning to happen. It was a real eye opener, and one of the things I love the most about the book. Yeah, I've been selfish and asked you too many of my own questions. So let me just take a look at this other screen I have where some of the questions are coming in. And filtered through our Middle States team. So Charles Keller asks a question about his work as an instructional coach. He primarily supports new teachers, and he wonders if you see a connection between teacher self-efficacy and what might be perceived by the teacher as a loss of control by allowing kids to learn through play or through social interactions. Does it, I guess maybe that's another way of saying, like, does it sideline the teacher a little bit? Does it diminish the teacher a little bit to foster those kinds of learning experiences?
It does change the teacher's role. I think that's undeniable, but I think the creation of cognitively congenial situations is a lot of what good teachers do already. And there's nothing unimportant or trivial about doing that. I think it's actually quite sophisticated and quite challenging to think. In fact, I think it's probably easier to stand up at the front of the classroom and have that kind of one-dimensional, knowledge dump, from the brain of the teacher to the brains of the students. And we know that doesn't work very well. So it's actually, it demands a lot more of the teacher. I think it demands more intelligence and sensitivity and creativity and an ingenious kind of, it requires perspective taking and thinking about what this is going to feel like and look like from the student's point of view. So I think it's, the extended mind has affected me in a lot of ways, including being a parent. And I now think of being a parent, for example, as much more of a process of creating congenial situations for my kids than some kind of didactic, lecturing them. And it's I find it quite interesting and exciting to approach parenting and teaching that way. So I think it preserves the importance of the teacher, but it does change the nature of their role.
Yeah, and I'm only seeing the question, now as I'm asking it to you, but my thinking out loud response to that question from Charles is that the more specific shift that the teacher has to make is being from the one doing the direct instruction to the one doing a lot of formative assessment, just observing, maybe not even saying anything or interrupting or intervening, but noting the learning that's happening, the kinds of learning that may be happening in play or in social interactions, and then using those multiple kind of moments of formative assessment to adjust whatever is going to happen next in that lesson, in tomorrow's lesson, so on and so forth. And I would agree that that's a more demanding role for the teacher, but also perhaps a more rewarding role, because it's a lot more like being a coach. You can't get out onto the court and play the game for the players, but when you coach players and they go out and they perform at a level that they maybe didn't think was possible, that's one of the most rewarding experiences I've ever had, and most coaches I know would say the same thing. Another really interesting question, and I don't know if this is necessarily a contrarian point of view, but I have heard in the last few days and talking to friends about the conversation that you and I were going to have, like, well, okay, I get what you're saying, but I can learn a lot from reading a book. I can learn a lot from watching a video. Now, these are adults, and so here's the question: is the interactive part of learning reinforced as we see interaction recede when adults mature? Does the learning also recede because adults can just pick up a book and learn more fluently, or watch a video? I guess in some ways it's sort of the difference between, the masterclass model or watching YouTube to learn how to do something versus having a live, synchronous, cohort-based experience of learning. Or would you say, no, like, we really do need social learning all the time?
Yeah, what that puts me in mind of, Christian, is your earlier point about how you had some irrational exuberance earlier in your career around the possibility of educational technology. And I feel like a lot of us have traveled that path, and recognized that for some students, like an online course, for example, is going to be exactly what they need. And it's going to be a resource that they can take advantage of in full, the way the questioner was saying, I can learn a lot from a book. People like us who are at that point of mastery of our craft and can sort of pluck the fruits of a book or of an online course. That's a position we were able to get to because all those fundamental building blocks of learning are already in place, and so that's not where most young people, most novices, most students are going to be. And that's behind the failure of a lot of educational technology that's assumed that you could put a student in front of a computer and the world is now their oyster. No, actually, there's a whole lot of internal structures, cognitive structures that need to be built before anyone could take advantage of a sort of relatively less structured resource like that. So that might be the goal that we want to get to, but it takes a lot of, I think, outside the brain learning to get there. And then I also just want to put in a plug for the continuing relevance and importance of outside the brain learning, even for mature adults or mature students who can sort of live in our heads, that there is so much more to learning and to the world of knowledge and expertise that is available to us when we take advantage of the body, of spaces, of other people. And I wouldn't want anyone to miss out on that and think that the brain is all it takes.
Yeah. We are almost at time. So I want to suggest, at least for me, 3 big takeaways from this conversation, Annie, and then thank you, and then we'll sign off. So the first is that the entire educational system has really been built on a faulty assumption that the brain and the mind is only inside the skull. And once we rethink that, we really have enormous opportunity to improve what the learning experience is like for both kids and adults. The second is about your comment on, being of two minds with ChatGPT. Yes, it can be an incredible tool to extend our thinking. And at the same time, we do still need to attend to developing that baseline set of knowledge, facts, those Lego pieces that are referred to, so that it can be a combination of using those building blocks with the tool that extends our thinking. Mm-hmm. And then the third would be the notion that the biological brain or the naked brain is truly limited, and that by understanding how to offload some of the cognitive load and increase the capacity of our working memory, and to restore and resupply our attention, that we can also not only extend the mind, but maybe improve its functioning as well. So Annie, this was awesome. Thank you so much for taking time with us. I'm really grateful. I also want to say thank you to everybody in the audience. If you have not bought Annie's book, it must be the next thing on your reading list, please. You're going to get an email from us soon as a follow-up. It'll just take 60 seconds for you to reply to a couple of questions, so please do that. And Annie, any last words?
I just wanted to say I dropped my email address in the chat there. If anybody wants to reach out and ask a question or whatever, I'd love to hear from you. I love that the book has been received especially enthusiastically by teachers, because that's kind of where it all got started. So that makes me happy.
Well, thank you again, Annie. We're really grateful, and I hope to talk to you again soon.